The outlaw's words seemed to freeze the entire room. He was supposed to be dead. Elias Grant stood motionless, his revolver still pointed toward the man. Behind him, Mara Ellis held 2-year-old Noah against her chest. "What did you just say?" Elias asked. The outlaw's face had lost all its color. He looked at Noah as if the little boy were something impossible. "You don't know what you're protecting," he whispered. Elias stepped closer. "Then tell me." The man swallowed hard. "Ye child is the reason they killed his father." Mara's eyes filled with fear. "Don't listen to him." But Elias could hear the desperation in her voice. The outlaw suddenly reached for his gun. Elias reacted instantly, knocking the weapon from his hand and forcing him against the wall. "Start talking." The man struggled. The boy's father discovered a land scheme. Ranchers were being forced off their properties through forged documents. Anyone who refused disappeared. Elias's expression hardened. "And Noah?" The outlaw looked toward the child. His father found proof that could expose everyone. Before he could say more, a gunshot shattered the window. The outlaw collapsed to the floor, and Elias realized someone outside had silenced him. Mara screamed and dropped behind the table with Noah. Elias moved toward the broken window, but the shooter was already gone. Outside, horses thundered away into the darkness. Elias returned to Mara. "You're leaving." She shook her head. "Where?" "Somewhere they can't find you." Mara stared at him. "There is nowhere." Elias looked at Noah, then at the blood-stained floor. "Then we'll make somewhere." He picked up a lantern and led them toward the barn. The night was silent when they reached the horses. Too silent. Elias knew the attackers would return. He helped Mara onto a horse, and carefully placed Noah in front of her. "Stay close to me." Mara nodded. They rode toward the northern hills, where Elias knew an old hunting cabin hidden between the trees. It was far from the main roads and almost impossible to find, unless someone knew where to look, but they never reached it. Halfway through the forest, Elias suddenly raised his hand. "Stop." He froze. Elias listened. Somewhere ahead, branches were breaking. Then came the unmistakable sound of horses. "They're waiting for us." Mara looked around desperately. "What do we do?" Elias pointed toward a narrow trail leading down the hillside. "Trust me." They turned their horses and disappeared between the trees just as several riders entered the clearing. The chase became brutal. Branches struck Elias's shoulders as he guided his horse through the darkness. Mara held Noah tightly, trying to keep him quiet. Behind them, gunshots echoed between the trees. Elias suddenly saw an old wooden bridge ahead. He crossed it and pulled his horse to the other side. Then he turned back. The riders were approaching. Elias fired at the bridge's support rope. The old structure collapsed behind them, forcing the pursuers to stop. For several minutes there was only silence. Then Mara whispered, "You saved us." Elias looked at her. "Not yet." They continued until they reached the hidden cabin before sunrise. Elias opened the door, lit the fireplace, and gave Mara a blanket. Noah was exhausted and fell asleep against her shoulder. For the first time since Elias had met them, Mara looked calm. Yet Elias noticed something. Noah's little wooden horse had fallen from his coat. He picked it up. There was something strange about it. The bottom was loose. Elias twisted it carefully. A tiny compartment opened. Inside was a rolled piece of paper. Ira saw it and immediately stood. "No." Elias looked at her. "What?" "Give it to me." He didn't. Instead he slowly opened the paper. There was a list of names, 23 names, ranchers to bankers, lawmen, and at the bottom, Sheriff Thomas Reed. Kiara closed her eyes. "My husband hid that inside Noah's toy." Elias looked at her. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because everyone who knew about that list died." Elias stared at the names. "Not everyone." Mara looked at him. "What?" Elias pointed at one name near the middle, Daniel Grant, his own brother. Elias stopped breathing. "My brother died 15 years ago." Mara whispered, "He didn't." Elias looked at her in disbelief. "Then who was the man buried under his name?" Miara's voice trembled. "Your brother discovered the same conspiracy long before my husband did." Suddenly, a sound came from outside, a horse, then another. Elias blew out the lantern. Mara held Noah tightly. They waited in darkness. Footsteps approached the cabin. Someone stopped outside the door. Then a familiar voice spoke through the cold night. "Elias." His blood ran cold. It was Sheriff Thomas Reed. "Open the door." Elias slowly raised his revolver. The sheriff continued, "You've been protecting the wrong people." Elias looked at Mara. Mara shook her head. "Don't trust him." The door suddenly exploded inward. 3 armed men rushed inside. Elias fired. The cabin erupted into chaos. One attacker charged him. Elias slammed him against the wall. Another tried to reach Mara, but she grabbed a heavy iron fireplace tool and struck his arm, forcing him back. The sheriff remained outside, watching through the doorway. Elias fought with everything he had. He knocked one man down, blocked another's attack. Then the third outlaw tackled him through the wooden table. Mara screamed. Noah woke up crying. Elias pushed himself to his feet. The sheriff stepped inside. His revolver was pointed directly at Noah. "Give me the boy." Mara stepped between them. "No." The sheriff's expression became cold. "Then you die with him." Elias raised his weapon. "You'll have to get through me." The sheriff smiled. "That's exactly what I wanted." And he revealed something that made Mara's face turn completely white, a small silver pendant, the same symbol Noah wore, but this one belonged to Daniel Grant. Elias stared at it. The sheriff smiled. "Your brother didn't die 15 years ago, Elias." He paused. "He became one of." Elias's hand tightened around his revolver. Outside, dozens of riders surrounded the cabin. The sheriff stepped backward. "Come outside, Elias. There's someone waiting to meet you." Elias looked toward Mara, then Noah, then the dark doorway, and somewhere beyond the trees. A man's voice called his name, a voice Elias had not heard in 15 years. "Brother." Elias froze because the voice belonged to the one man he had buried in his heart long ago, Daniel Grant. A single word echoed through the cabin. "Brother." Elias Grant stood completely still, his revolver lowered by only an inch. For 15 years, he had carried the memory of Daniel Grant inside him. A younger brother he believed had died during a cattle raid, when they were barely grown men. He had attended a funeral, he had buried a coffin, he had spent years believing he was the last Grant left, yet now that impossible voice was standing somewhere beyond the cabin door. Mara pulled Noah close while Elias whispered, "Daniel." The voice answered, "You should have stayed out of this." The sheriff stepped aside, and a man emerged from the darkness. He was older, thinner, and harder than Elias remembered, but the eyes were unmistakable. Gray eyes. Daniel lowered his hat. For a moment, neither brother spoke. Elias finally said, "You were alive." Daniel answered, "I had to be." Elias's face hardened. "You let me bury an empty coffin." Daniel looked away. "If you had known I survived, they would have killed you too." Elias stepped toward him. "So you joined them?" Daniel's expression changed. "He joined them because it was the only way to destroy them." Mara stared at Daniel in disbelief. "Then why are you here?" Daniel looked at her and then at Noah. "Because they found the boy." Elias tightened his grip on his revolver. "Who are they?" Daniel replied, "The people behind everything." He explained that the land thefts had begun more than a decade earlier. Powerful ranch owners, bankers, and corrupt officials had created a secret network that used forged deeds, intimidation, and violence to take control of entire valleys. Daniel had infiltrated the organization years ago, pretending to work for them while secretly collecting evidence. Mara's husband had discovered part of the same operation. When he tried to expose it, he was murdered. "But why Noah?" Elias asked. Daniel looked toward the child. "Because his father didn't leave the evidence on paper. He memorized the final location of the original land records, and gave the key to his son." Mara shook her head. "Noah is only 2, he doesn't know anything." Daniel nodded. "Exactly, that's why they need him alive. They believe the key is hidden somewhere on him." Mara looked down at Noah's coat. Elias immediately remembered the wooden horse. He examined it again and found another hidden compartment beneath the first. Inside was a tiny brass key. Daniel's eyes widened. "That's it." Elias held the key in his palm. "Where does it lead?" Daniel answered, "The old courthouse vault." Sheriff Reed suddenly raised his gun. "Enough." He pointed at Daniel. "You've talked too long." Daniel turned. "And you've lied too long." A gunshot exploded. Daniel moved first, pushing Elias aside as the bullet tore through the wall. The cabin erupted into chaos. Elias tackled one gunman while Mara carried Noah into the bedroom. Daniel fought the sheriff near the doorway. The two men exchanged blows, each knowing the other too well. Elias knocked one attacker unconscious, then turned toward Daniel just as Sheriff Reed pulled a knife. Daniel blocked the strike, but the sheriff escaped into the night. "Don't let him reach town," Daniel shouted. Elias ran outside. The ranch was surrounded by armed riders. For a few seconds, the night seemed endless. Then Elias stepped forward with his revolver drawn. "You came for one little boy," he shouted. "Now you're going to have to get through every man standing between you and him." The first rider charged. Elias fired into the ground, startling the horse and throwing the rider off balance. Daniel joined him. Together the brothers fought through the attackers. One man swung a rifle at Elias, but Daniel intercepted him. Another tried to enter the cabin, only to find Mara standing in the doorway with Noah behind her. Mara wasn't the frightened woman Elias had met beneath the old store anymore. She had become someone willing to fight for her child. She slammed the door shut and locked it. Outside, Elias and Daniel pushed the remaining riders back toward the trees. Then a distant bell began ringing. The town was waking. People were coming. The ranchers who had been threatened for years started arriving with rifles. They had seen enough. Sheriff Reed's men were no longer hunting one woman and one child. They were facing an entire community that had finally decided to resist. Reed realized he was losing. He mounted his horse and escaped toward Mercy Creek. Elias looked at Daniel. "We finish this tonight." They rode after him. At dawn, they reached the courthouse. Sheriff Reed stood on the steps holding the original land records in one hand and a torch in the other. "You think exposing me will change anything?" he shouted. "Half this town belongs to me." Mara stepped forward with Noah in her arms. "No," she looked at the frightened townspeople, "it belongs to the people who built it." Daniel produced the evidence he had collected for 15 years. Names, bank records, forged deeds, confessions, everything. The crowd became silent. Then one old rancher stepped forward. "My land was stolen 12 years ago." Another followed. "So was mine." Then another, and another. Reed's power disappeared in front of him. He tried to run. Elias stopped him. The two men fought on the courthouse steps. Reed was ruthless, but Elias refused to surrender. After a fierce struggle, Elias finally disarmed him and forced him to the ground. Reed looked up. "You think you're a hero?" Elias shook his head. "No." He looked toward Mara and Noah. "I just finally decided who I was willing to protect." Reed was arrested. The land records were recovered. The ranches were returned to their rightful families, and the conspiracy that had controlled Mercy Creek for years finally collapsed. But Elias still had one question. He turned toward Daniel. "Why didn't you come home?" Daniel looked at the sunrise. "Because I was afraid you'd hate me." Elias was silent. Then he stepped forward and embraced his brother. For 15 years, he had believed he was alone. He had been wrong. Weeks later, Mercy Creek was different. Mara and Noah stayed at Elias's ranch while she rebuilt her life. Noah became attached to the old wooden rocking horse near the fireplace. Every evening, Elias would sit nearby while the little boy played. One evening, Mara stood on the porch watching them. "You know," she said softly, "when I first saw you walking toward us, I thought you were another man I needed to fear." Elias smiled. "And now?" Mara looked at Noah. "Now I think you were the first person who walked toward us when everyone else walked away." Elias looked at her. "He almost didn't, but you did." Noah suddenly laughed from inside the house. Both of them looked toward him. For the first time in months, Mara smiled without fear. Elias looked across his ranch. The fences needed repairing, the barn needed work. There was still plenty of hardship ahead, but the ranch was no longer empty. There was laughter inside the house. A child's footsteps on the wooden floor. And two people who had survived a world that tried to separate them. Elias had once believed that family was something you were born into. Now he understood something different. Sometimes family was the person you chose to protect. Sometimes it was the child who trusted you before he even knew your name. And sometimes, it was the woman who arrived with nothing except her child and the courage to keep going. Mara walked beside him. Noah ran ahead through the grass. Elias watched them and smiled. The lonely cowboy was no longer alone, and the woman everyone ignored on that dusty street had finally found a place she could call home. The end.